Hi everyone, Professor King here. In this video, I'm going to be discussing Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick's. For someone with a lisp, that's a lot of S going on. Just so you know. So I may jumble the name here and there in this video. Anyway, I'm going to be talking about Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick's Epistemology of the Closet. So I'll take it to a share screen, but as I always like to remind you at the beginning and ends of my videos, one, if any questions arise for you, because this one particularly is written in that sort of philosophical, theoretical language very densely that can be challenging for us. Please feel free to message me to unpack some of this, because I do understand that this stuff ain't easy, right? But if it were easy, it wouldn't be worth it. So whatever. The other thing is, please make sure to pause as you follow this video so that you can take notes. Sometimes I tend to speak a little quickly. Sometimes I take a really long time on certain topics. I try to make my pacing as helpful as possible, but everyone's pacing levels are different. So just keep in mind, right, to follow along and pause where you need to pause, to reflect, digest, take notes, etc. Okay, without further ado, let's go to the share screen / PowerPoint. Let me go to current slide. Oops. No, I want to go to the start. So this is Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick's Epistemology of the Closet. So let's start off by kind of clarifying some terms, defining some terms, because I'm sure, a lot of us, when we think about queer theory, LGBTQIA plus studies, we've heard the term the closet before, maybe most of us have, but I want to make sure we're all on the same page, because again, this language can be a little challenging and dense, so we got to take our time with it, right? So first, there's Eve Sedgwick right there. Unfortunately, Eve is no longer with us. She passed away in 2009, but she was a pioneer of queer theory. Okay, so I want to start by kind of going over the fundamentals of queer theory. And I'm trying to move my video so that you can see these words, but actually I don't know if it matters for you all. Anyway, the first notion of queer theory, or actually, I didn't really do these in order, so just kind of know that all of these pertain to the study of queer theory. And you may say, oh, queer theory? I thought it was inappropriate to call gay people queer. And kind of the rationale behind that, the naming of that school of theory, queer theory, is to kind of push back against that, right? To kind of stick one's nose up, shall we say, at this sort of heterosexual oppression and say, you know what, if you called me this as a mocking term, right, I'm going to use it as right back at you as kind of a term of empowerment, right? So you'll see a lot of stuff, maybe on YouTube or, in the media today about queer theory, or let's queer things up, or queries, right? Those are, when we talk about them, from the groups that identify, as LGBTQIA plus, Two-Spirit, etc., they are using those terms as an empowering tool, right? And deliberately. Now, if some middle-aged straight guy in a suit was like, oh, you queers, right? That wouldn't be appropriate. So just be aware of the distinction. Okay, so the first one is this notion of othering and otherness as they relate to gender and sexuality. Either gender, sexuality, both, neither, right? Separate or as intersectional categories that we'll talk about in a little bit. But you may hear this term queer as a verb, like the queering of a particular text or television show. And what it's doing is it's looking at that lens of sexuality and gender to an extent And the ways in which those identity markers are othering, right, or reflect otherness, right? And I want to clarify that, you know, otherness is separate in this sense than the way that Said uses the other, right? Because when Said talks about the other in post-colonial theory, he is specifically talking about it in terms of a colonized subject, right? Someone from a community that has been, you know, under Western imperial rule and has been made to feel other. The act is somewhat the same, right? There is oppression involved, there is lack of understanding, there are power dynamics involved, but in queer theory, we're talking about it in terms of sexuality and or gender. And what do we do with that relationship between sexuality and gender? When we look at Sedgwick, right, when we look at epistemology of the closet, we're looking at exactly that. What do we do with these concepts, these terms, these identity markers? Should they even relate to one another? Or do we need a new vocabulary, a new language to talk about sexuality away from gender, right? But since gender is, you know, is part of the discussion, we see, and Kosofsky Sedgwick points out, that this has a relationship to feminist theory, right? That this is, you know, it's an offshoot, if you will. It's the spin-off, but it's its own thing, because, you know, we started these discussions about feminist theory as far back as 200 years ago, and clearly we've had multiple sexualities since the beginning of time, right? But again, in the Western theoretical, literary theoretical tradition, we've always kind of considered them as interlocking, and Sedgwick is saying, well, is that necessarily the case, right? And because this Western system is historically so binary and so heteronormative, right, we're seeking liberation from that. So what do I mean by binary? What do I mean by heteronormative? Well, Western society is, in terms of its view of gender, not as advanced as other societies, right? In Native societies, you can have multiple genders. You can have two-spirit in indigenous cultures. You can have, you know, in the Indian subcontinent, you have any number of gender expressions, right? In the Western world, those have really been whittled down to these. And we talked about essentialist terms before, but we'll revisit that today. The essentialism of male or female, right? And queer theory says, let's interrogate that. Let's liberate ourselves from this, right? We don't need that binary anymore, because that binary is false, right? We know from loads of scientific, historical, sociological research that there are far more than two genders. So, right, we have to interrogate that. When we talk about heteronormativity, some of us have heard that term, some of us have not. What heteronormativity means is essentially the way that Western society has deemed heterosexuality the norm, right? We talked about this a little bit with Foucault. And Foucault said that the reason for that was, you know, to literally create a human labor force, right, through procreation. But queer theory is going beyond Foucault and looking, you know, Foucault is kind of a granddaddy of this, but we're going beyond Foucault to interrogate that, right? It's not that the male female heterosexual couple, monogamous childbearing couple is the only norm, right? Again, if we have a multitude of sexualities and we have a multitude of gender expressions, we've got to interrogate these things. Again, we have to talk about the closet. And to Sedgwick, the closet is essentially this kind of open secret of oh, I'm sorry. The G, I typoed the G. It's in there. I just typoed it. Ooh, ooh. There we go. I will fix as I go. Thank you very much. It's the open secret. And we have to think about, in terms of othering and otherness and power relationships, right? If there are groups in our society that have been told to suppress themselves, that have been told to hide parts of who they are, whether that's based on gender or sexuality or class or race or whatever else, right? Then what happens is this closeting, right? We see it most apparently in discussions of sexuality, as Foucault pointed out, right? Like the power's obsession with sexuality and that attempt to suppress only makes it sort of explode, right? But you know, the closet being the open secret, meaning like it's slippery, right? It's slippery in that like there is a heteronormative power structure in place historically in Western society that seeks to suppress anything that's not, you know, heteronormative. But at the same time, if there are a multitude of genders and sexualities, then they have to exist somewhere, right? So they exist as sort of this open secret in the closet, right? And that's, again, the idea of closeting one's sexuality serves that heteronormative goal, right? If you can hide your sexuality, that favors or privileges, right, anything, you know, the power, the heterosexual power structure. And these are some of the things that people like Sedgwick and Gail Rubin and Judith Butler and Foucault and so many others are interrogating. And the word epistemology, that's a big one. It's part of the title, so I thought we should cover it. Epistemology is the study of knowledge, right? The study of what separates belief from empirical research. And so think about that in terms of what Sedgwick is talking about, the epistemology of the closet. She's not talking about morality. She's not talking about my political beliefs versus your political beliefs. She's not talking about what my religion says versus your religion. She's saying hard-hitting scientific factual research, right? Our study of what sexualities and genders have wrought thus far in the early 90s when she's publishing this, right? So, you know, so much surrounding discussions of sexuality have to do with, you know, emotions, right? And that's not to invalidate those approaches, but it's to say, no, here is the cold hard facts, right? Like here's what we see theoretically. All right, so here are some premises that we see going on in this text. Again, thinking about epistemology, thinking about all this research done, this empirical, data-driven, fact-driven research, right? No matter the amount of research done, society still defaults to biological sex equaling gender preference. And that is not the case, right? The sex with which we are born, right? The sex organs with which we are born are not necessarily always the same as the gender that we identify with, right? And we see this all over, like, again, we see this in so many ways. And if we want to bring it back to people like Said and synthesize it with people like Spivak, right? We see these colonized cultures, so many of these colonized cultures, you know, indigenous cultures in North America, cultures on the Indian subcontinent, etc., that have historically viewed gender in a much more fluid way, in a much more expressive way, in a less binaristic way. And we see how the Western, influence kind of crushes that, right? Or seeks to remove that. And so, again, our society defaults to this sex equals gender thing. And that is just an untruth, right? If we want to call it fake news, right? We could call it that. And what this does is it makes all of that which is socialized, which is artificial, which is created by our society, it makes it appear natural, right? Like, how many times have you heard the ridiculous notion of like, men are strong and women are vulnerable, right? Or men are logical. We'll talk about this next one in a moment. Men are logical and women are emotional, right? Goes back to the binary, very, very lacking in terms of acknowledging the complexity of human existence, and it's just plain wrong. It's wrong. So we have to keep these in mind, right? And this contributes to the disadvantaging of the female and that which is considered the feminine, right? In this binary model. So anything within that binary model that was considered not masculine, that is disadvantaged, right? Because if we think about power relationships, and we think about power relationships in terms of gender, who clearly has held power in Western society since essentially its inception? Men, right? Cisgender, heterosexual men. So this disadvantages anything that's not that. And when we look back to feminist theory, that would be the female, right? In this binary model. But now we see that that doesn't just include the female, that includes the non-binary, the agender, the intersex, the transgender, right? All of these, right? The two-spirit. And so because it's binaristic, right? And because we know that sex is biological and gender is preference, right? Then why are we still basing sexuality based on this sort of gender sex binary? In other words, why is a man really sexually attracted to a man considered gay? Why is a woman sexually attracted to a woman considered bisexual? Like, why are we bringing in their gender to talk about their sexuality? It's as unrelated or related, either way, to the discussion of sex as class, as race, etc. Right? Like, in other words, like, there are people who have a sexual preference for, who have a sexual, there are heterosexual people who have a sexual preference for, the other gender who's much younger than them, right? There are heterosexual people who have a sexual preference for those who have much more money than they do, right? If you go on, and earmuffs if anyone you're embarrassed is watching NSFW alert, if you go on any pornographic website, there's so much more than just gay, straight, lesbian, etc., right? And so what Sedgwick is saying is, because of this multiplicity of sexualities, right, why are we basing so much of our understanding of sexuality on gender alone? It goes, it reinforces the gender binary. So if we think about theory, right, a lot of theory is responding to what came before it, but seeing a lack. And so, jumping into that empty space where the lack is and creating space, okay? So her question essentially is, why does our understanding of sexuality or sexual orientation imply gender, right? So again, sex and gender should be independent of one another, but we should still acknowledge intersectionality when considering all identities and forms of oppression, because clearly those play a role even when we're talking about sexuality, right? And in slides to come, we're going to look at how that affects trans women, right? Trans women of color. because of these outdated models, right? Excuse me, I need a little drink of water. Because of these outdated models, you know, and Sedgwick doesn't really go into this. This is just sort of like riffing, my riffing, right? But because of these outdated models of seeing gender as a binary, of seeing sex as dependent upon gender, what's happening is people who are further and further and further away from power because of their identity markers, subalterns, if you will, right? They experience oppression at alarmingly higher rates. And when we talk about, you know, how that's related to sexuality in a moment, I'll try and provide examples that make sense. Okay, so back to Sedgwick. Sedgwick says, you know, she's talking about an essentialism of sexual object choice is far less easy to maintain than one of gender, because again, we have a whole spectrum, right? You know, and think about like, furries, right? Like, how in the heck does what does, you know, if you're unclear with the furry community, there's actually a furry night at an establishment not far from my house. So it's a, you know, it's a pretty large community of like-minded, interested people. Furries are people who, you know, dress up like certain furry animals, usually from kingdom Mammalia, right? Because of the fur aspect. And they socialize with one another. And sometimes that socialization is, you know, for a sex object purpose, meaning like the ultimate goal is to hook up, right? Not for all furries. Some people just, you know, it's a preference thing, but for others, there's definitely a sex object component. And by sex object, we mean that thing that one is attracted to sexually, right? That thing that is sort of the goal of one's sexual desire, right? And so it's, again, Sedgwick doesn't talk about furries, but furries are a great example of how this form of sexuality has less to do with gender, and it has far more to do with some other aspect of the sex object of choice, right? So think about that, right? Think about people who have like foot fetishes, or people who, you know, people who, you know, their sex object of choice has nothing to do with another person, right? It has to do with, you know, some sort of like leather object or something like that, right? Like, so think about these things. We're still in NSFW, by the way, so tell whoever to go away. We're all adults here. This is privileged information under the Federal Education Right to Privacy Act, so we're allowed to talk about this as a room full of adults, as a cyber room full of adults, right? Okay. So how does this relate to literary analysis, right? We have to talk about that because that's what we're talking about, is an English lit class. Well, if binary gender assumptions abound in literature, clearly, right, especially Western literature, and in texts, then they need to be addressed, right? And, you know, like think of all of the books you've read, the texts you've read that rely on very outdated assumptions about sex, about gender, right? If you read, you know, if you take a survey class that's of any historical period whatsoever, there are going to be gender assumptions that just make your jaw drop, right? And so we have to consider what that shows us about that text. And if there are liberatory texts that push back against that, what does that mean? Where do we go from here, right? So, you know, one of the things, you know, one of the implications is, again, this sort of like logical man or logical masculine entity and like this emotional feminine, right? Like even Freud, you know, who talked about hysteria, right? That came from this very inaccurate, unscientific notion that women, because we have uteruses, are somehow more prone to extreme emotion. And one danger, as we see in the play and in other works covered in this class, is this notion of gay panic and trans panic. And for those of you who are not familiar with what gay panic and or trans panic are, again, they are over emotional responses, usually out of fear, homophobia, etc., in which there is a fixation, there is a terror on the part of the heterosexual, usually the heterosexual male, but not always, that, you know, that where they respond to queerness in a very over-exaggerated way, right? And there was actually, and this is where I'm going to bring in some of this, again, this is not in Sedgwick, but this is where I want you to think about some of these concepts that Sedgwick talks about. In the real world, right, IRL, and in literature. So there's actually, in the majority of states, I believe it's still legal in 40 states in the United States, when we're talking about Western culture, to present the gay panic defense. And if you've never heard of the gay panic defense, essentially what the gay panic defense is it says that if a gay person hits on or sexually harasses a member of the same sex, then that person is well within their rights to freak out and attack the other gay person, right? It doesn't always work in trials, but it's a defense that has been used, right? That, and again, it's typically for a male defendant, not always, but typically. And the defense goes something like this, you know. And these two women here are an example of the gay panic defense, you know, trying to defend something that is horrifically wrong, right? Murder. These are two trans women who were murdered in the last year. And really trans panic defense, not gay panic defense. But if we think about how our society looks at sex in a binary, this is going to make more sense, okay? So these two trans women are sex workers. And there is a massive cultural problem in our society of people, a majority of whom are men, who are attracted to trans women, but are afraid or ashamed of that attraction for very unscientific, antiquated reasons. Keep following me, right? So when conflict can happen, right, in the case of like a sex worker and a John, or a partner and you know, a trans partner and a partner who has more heterosexual privilege, etc. These cases, particularly, these women were killed by men. And part of the cultural response a lot of the time, unfortunately, is, well, what if he didn't know they were a man? First of all, they're not men, right? We've already talked at length about how gender is a spectrum. These people are not men, right? Gender is not biological sex. And so if that is the case, a man attracted to these women who is traditionally attracted to women, to people who identify as women, should have no problem being open and out about that. However, because of these antiquated binary heteronormative approaches in our society, these homophobic approaches in our society, these misogynistic approaches in our society, we see, right, that men who love trans women who feel somehow outed, right, then feel sometimes justified in enacting revenge or violence or even murder against such women. And this is a very complex but very perfect example of a byproduct of what Sedgwick is talking about. Because if our society truly believed, right, let's go with some premises here because you got to follow me. If our society truly believed that sex is not gender, and our society truly believed that all genders were equal to heterosexual cisgender men, then there would be no problem in a heterosexual cisgender man being with a transgender woman. Wouldn't be a problem. Clearly that is not the case because we see that the homicide rates of transgender women are astronomically high. They're higher than essentially any other social group, right? The lifespan, the life expectancy of a trans woman is 34 years old because of these systemic issues going on, these intersectional systemic issues such as class and race being included in that, right? And so when we think about the dangers, right, we see the dangers in literature, and you know, when we talk about M. Butterfly, we definitely see how that danger is played with in the character of Song in a very interesting way, right? But we also have to think about our own society, right? And so going back to this idea of the closet, right? When we know all this, that question of why do people from this community, from a variety of backgrounds of other identity markers, class, race, etc., country of origin, why do they feel the need to remain closeted? Everything's hunky-dory, right? Like, why would people feel the need to remain closeted? Well, I mean, it's kind of an overly simplistic rhetorical question, but you know, clearly the answer is everything is not hunky-dory, that there is danger in these gender binaries, that there is danger in this male privileging or masculine privileging, that there is danger in equating gender and sexuality, right? Because if there weren't, we wouldn't have some of the horrific societal interpersonal pandemics, not talking about, you know, viral pandemics, but you know, these really horrific sort of existences for some people that we have in our world today. So let's talk a little bit more about M. Butterfly specifically, right? If we think back, because Song really manipulates, and I don't use manipulate in a negative connotation kind of a way. Song really manipulates the gender binary to some really interesting, fascinating, perhaps even revolutionary and liberatory ends, right? Whereas Gaia Mard's gender assumptions lead him down a different path, let's say, right? So are there gender assumptions that the characters hold that, and not just these two, but other characters, right? If we think about like Gaia Mard's wife or, you know, other men that sort of play small ancillary roles in the play, are there gender assumptions that reflect this inaccurate gender binary that affect the plot of this play, and how? And if you think about this, what does that mean? What do you think about it? How do you feel about what happens based on these gender assumptions? So I know that was a lot, that, you know, kind of felt like the Candyland route to getting to back to the play, but I promise you, right, that we got back there. And one thing that might help in thinking about these things like the binary, heteronormativity, gay panic, read the Wadler article and tell me if in a real historical research sense, we don't see some of that, right? We're not exposed to some of that. All right, so I'll take it off the share screen now. I hope this was incredibly helpful and clarified Sedgwick's, philosophical theoretical language a little bit. Hope you had time to pause. If not, you can always go back and review and pause as you go. Please feel free to contact me with any questions, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your night. All right, bye.